Hi, folks. This is the second part of the lecture on ecocinema and globalization, in which I'm going to discuss the films that I've set up through the discussion of science fiction genre, and also the idea of allegory and the allegory of the post-apocalyptic film. So let's start with Snowpiercer. The opening sequence, we see an apocalypse that's caused by an attempt by science to correct climate change with one technique. This is a classic critique of science that we see in a lot of science fiction films, where it's the hubris or pride of scientists who think that they can solve all of the problems of the world with one experiment. Of course, it goes terribly wrong, and the Earth is surrounded or is plunged into polar darkness, which means that we have the sole survivors of humanity on a train that is somehow going on almost in perpetual motion, around and around. A powerful train that becomes organized as an allegory of human society. And so the allegory here is that we have human society, by definition, cut off from nature. Nature is so forbidding, so violent and inhospitable that we have to be enclosed from it. But it's not really a film about a train in perpetual motion. There's nothing realistic about this. Rather, it's a kind of thought experiment in how human society is organized. It's a very dark vision of human nature and a dark vision of how a political system can be set up to keep people literally in line. So within the allegory, what we have is a hermetically sealed group of humanity. Hermetic simply means enclosed, and it's sealed off from the exterior frozen natural world. It's hermetically sealed in terms of being a tube in the way that a train works, but even the two ends of the train are linked. We learn later in the film that the engineer of the train is in conversation with one of the leaders of the proletariat who are at the back of the train. So this idea of a hermetic loop, a kind of totally self-enclosed vision of human society, is exaggerated even further. The final image of the film, we have a reverse shot of the two humans who seem to have survived the crash at the end, looking at a polar bear who is looking at them. And the question of the future of humanity is interestingly posed here. We do have two survivors. They, in some ways, are looking. They're able to live outside the train, and polar bears exist, so life continues to exist. But I can also imagine that the polar bear is looking at the human beings and thinking, these folks look delicious. Within Snowpiercer, the allegory of human society is literalized in terms of class levels. And these class levels are literalized by the class you are traveling in the train. And it's a reminder of the ways in which, in things like travel, the idea of hierarchies between human beings are put there in relationship to how much you can pay. So it's fundamentally class is defined by money and your ability to have a certain class of treatment. And each train car, on some level, is an exaggerated snapshot of current classes and institutions that we find in Western society. At the back of the train, we have the lower class, who may or may not be employed, but are simply engaged in survival and had to be reduced to cannibalism at one point until someone sacrificed something in order to inspire people to try and be better and to resist the order within society. As they move up the train, they encounter soldiers, the military, who attempt to police the power structure. We see food production, the disgusting ways in which cockroaches are processed into the gelatin bricks that the lower classes eat. We see train cars devoted to education, and the leisure class gets the most amount of space, the rich. We pass through cars devoted to drug use, spas, a dance hall, and finally we get to the managerial class, and that is the train engineer who runs everything and who has the delusion that he is sacrificing himself for the good of humanity, while in reality he's simply imposing his ego and will over the society. It's an allegory of an authoritarian political system. where one authority figure, through their control of information, through their all-knowingness, has a sense that they know best and will calculate what's necessary for human beings to survive. There's a lot of references in the film to calculations, how many people must die in order for a kind of for an equilibrium to exist within the train. And within hermetically sealed environments, you often have the argument that it's what we call a zero-sum game. Anything that rises has to be compensated for by something falling off. And in this way, within this political system, even the idea of resistance is factored in, it's calculated. And so the attempts by the people at the back of the train to get to the front are calculated and allowed for, although there's some surprise at the success at the very end. We also see, in terms of thinking about environmental allegory and media, we see the focus of education within the train. It really is a form of ideological doctrination. We see these children in class led by an instructor, played by Alison Pill, it's a kind of satire of the ways in which education can be thought of as simply drilling values into students. We also see an example of audiovisual media, a sort of educational film is shown at one point, used for propaganda purposes. This is a very direct and mechanical picture of education, but we also see it mimicked in the ways in which the children who are kidnapped at the beginning of the film are trained in order to serve the train. And we see this kind of the mechanical movements that they rehearse over and over again that exist even as they get older. This is part of their mechanical training. And so here we have a sense that media is used in this world as a form of direct control. Again, a very dark vision of what media can be. Let's turn to Mad Max Fury Road. A remarkable film, in my opinion. It won 6 Academy Awards: production design, costume design, makeup and hairstyling, and from the mise en scène side, and then sound mixing, sound editing, and film editing on the editing side. Interestingly, of the people who won those awards, there were 5 women and 5 men. And that is an important gesture on the part of the filmmakers in terms of, we've talked about the ways in which gender works in film production and the ways in which women are often sidelined in terms of credit for film production. But I think in some ways the equity in production we see here reflects the feminist themes of the film. Now, the Mad Max franchise has been going for a long time. It started in 1979. There have been 4 films and a few more are planned. And when we have a franchise, we're in some ways dealing with a special case of genre. Genre is always a group of films. And what we do as scholars is do comparative analysis amongst those genres. And if we think that genres in some way are expressing cultural dreams and fantasies and anxieties, then we can also see how the Mad Max franchise reflects different social and political concerns over the decades. Now, Mad Max has always been a genre, a hybrid, and specifically it's hybridized the science fiction film with the Western. And the Western is an example of what Thomas Schatz calls a genre of order. We have a lone hero, a survivor, who lives in a world that is disordered, an uncivilized space, and attempts to try and provide order, usually through violence. What's interesting about the Western is that it always begins with a shot of the hero in the landscape, and it ends with them leading back into that landscape. There's a way in which the Western hero who works to create even a tentative civilized space, often a city or a town, or even simply a peaceful homestead, can never stay in that space that he helps establish. And at the end of Mad Max Fury Road, we see Max slip away amongst the crowd, making eye contact with Furiosa, but he can't stay in the Citadel, even though it's a place where life can continue. Now, the earlier Mad Max films in the franchise dealt with oil scarcity, the violence and effects of nuclear war. Mad Max Thunderdome deals with gladiatorial spectacle. It's kind of ahead of the game in anticipating how extreme fighting would become a kind of allegory for competition and capitalist society. And with Mad Max Fury Road, the most recent installment, we have a film that's focusing on gender and environmental destruction much more clearly than it had in other examples of the franchise. So let's look first at the gender allegory. So again, what I'm suggesting with allegory is that the real story is ridiculous, or the surface story is ridiculous. The real story is what's happening underneath. And in this case, this is an allegory about the effects of patriarchy. The head of the Citadel, Immortan Joe, is often called Dad. And he called Dad specifically by his son, whose actual name is Rictus Erectus. We have a sense of the masculine power that is being pointed to here. But Immortan Joe is a patriarch, and he ultimately enslaves women for purely biological purposes, for breeding, for their milk, for sex. And within the society, male figures are given all of the power, and their power is exercised through violence. Specifically, the other male characters are the war boys, who are promised salvation in a utopian Valhalla. And so they're indoctrinated to do what they can for their leaders. They're all dying of various forms of cancer or other ailments caused by the nuclear radiation around them. So they're kind of doomed. But what leads them to follow the authoritarian leader is this promise of salvation. So there's an ideological operation going on here. They're in some ways being indoctrinated into belief. And the moment that Nux, who is the war boy who joins the caravan led by Furiosa, gets a moment of human compassion, he switches sides, and we have a sense of the redemptive power of love and gentleness. In terms of thinking about media and environment, all of the sort of wonderful and ridiculous references to chrome. Chrome is a kind of medium in this way. It's a medium of intoxication, but also of ideology. The idea that with chrome, you're entering a different kind of state, a heightened state through the medium of the drug. And that's what enables you to go to that next level of violence. But it requires a certain kind of escape and loss of reality. So on the one side, we have the patriarchal forces. And on the other side, we have, led by Imperator Furiosa, a leader who frees the women from slavery and is leading this truck out of the Citadel into some kind of salvation. In this case, the salvation, they're seeking a utopian space called the Green Place, a place that she remembers from her childhood. She was kidnapped from a society of all women warriors, the Buvalini, and she eventually meets up with them again and learns that the Green Place has been despoiled. But we have very clear and stark contrast between heroic figures and evil figures, and Max is someone who somewhat amorally switches, is first kidnapped by Immortan Joe and his forces and the war boys, used as a blood bag, but then slowly aligns himself with the female characters led by Furiosa. So that's the gender allegory. In terms of an environmental allegory, it's clearly a story about the ways in which the control of resources and the prospects for how human beings can survive is being played out. Immortan Joe, the patriarchal leader, controls the Citadel, which is an area that has access to water springs, and this control of access to water and food is what allows him to have control politically over the land. Interestingly, the neighboring spaces that they're traveling to are named after commodities: Gastown, Bullet Farm. And it's clear that there are economic forces here that are being, whoever controls the commodities has political power, and they keep them through violence. Furiosa seeks a green place, which she in fact travels through unknowingly. It's now a ruined wasteland, ruined by the environmental destruction of nuclear war, of gas, of oil seeping up through the sand. And so that promised utopia, that promised green space, is now ruined. At one point in the film, she considers searching for another unsullied land across salt flats, but it might just be a suicide mission. Who knows if they would survive? And the idea that there's a utopia around the corner is, I think, critiques by the film that suggest that ultimately what they need to do is return to fight for control of the citadel, rather than seeking a utopia. And utopia as a word literally means no place. It doesn't really exist. Instead, they're going to fight to take the resources that do exist, embrace the idea of equitably sharing those resources, sharing them with the people, instead of just simply doling out the water from time to time. But it's a return to messy reality rather than thinking about some kind of idealistic future that exists. In the same way that Snowpiercer criticizes the idea of solving climate change with one experiment, an easy solution. In fact, the solution that we need is something that's messier and found ultimately in reality. I'm going to conclude by talking about briefly the two other films that were screened. One of them, Annihilation, which I think is a really remarkable film, not a post-apocalyptic film. This is not depicting what happens after society is ruined. There is a sense that an apocalypse is threatened by this alien presence that lands on the beach into a lighthouse, and the effects of that are what the characters are dealing with. So this is belongs to the alien invasion subgenre of science fiction. In this case, the alien invasion takes the form of the shimmer. This is this kind of area that is slowly expanding out of where the alien first landed. Anyone who goes into this zone is first highly disoriented in time and space. And at one point, one of the characters in the film says that the effect of the shimmer is that it's a prismatic mutation of genetic code. Anything that comes into that area is transformed prismatically, refracted. And that creates effects that are both monstrous. We have this giant albino crocodile, and we have the bear that is genetically mutated. But we also have sort of wondrous creations. Even the man who we see, his intestines have been transformed into writhing snakes, and his body eventually is splayed against the swimming pool. It becomes a kind of plant lichen mix. There's something absolutely horrible about it, but also something very beautiful. Even the ways in which plants grow up in the shape of trees is quite wondrous. It's different from the ways in which Snowpiercer and Mad Max Fury Road create very allegorically black and white visions of society and of values. With Annihilation, we're given an alien force that's not immoral, it's not evil, but rather seems to simply be transformative. I say here in the slide, the alien is less malevolent, that is evil or malicious, than it's voracious, simply hungry in consuming and transforming the earth. In some ways, it's like a virus that we're all hiding from right now. But biology and nature is amoral. It may destroy things, it may transform things, but it doesn't care. There's no particular moral code involved. And this reminds us of a phrase from Kiwei Chu's Ecocinema essay that I mentioned earlier. This is the way in which science fiction films can invite a shift beyond human-centered perspectives in perceiving the world. So Annihilation presents us with the effects of a nature that completely transforms things through this disorientation of time and space. But there would be one other interpretation of Annihilation, and that is it's less about biology, and it actually could be seen as an allegory for digital media itself. If you think about it, literally the alien presence is formed by digital media. The filmmakers have used digital media to create the illusions that we're seeing. The idea of the shimmer, the prism, the refraction, these are all optical metaphors. They're aesthetic metaphors. And the character of Lena, whose double is a kind of digital doppelganger, kind of like a putty figure who is slowly becoming Invasion of the Body Snatchers style, a version of her, but it's all digitally created. And so one way of thinking about this in terms of in media and environment is that maybe the allegory is less about environment and it's more about the way in which media has become a second environment, perhaps as amoral and as voracious as biology is in taking things over. It's a very thought-provoking film where there are lots of interesting ways in which we can think about how the presentation of an alien presence, of an other presence, can be, as I say, as wondrous as it is monstrous. I'll conclude by just discussing Awakening. It's a short 9-minute film. Dennis Goulet, who's an Indigenous Canadian artist, made. And it's an interesting example of taking an ancient Indigenous story, a Cree story of the trickster hero Wesekechak, battling against a monstrous figure, a kind of ancient monster named Wetigo. And that's an ancient story that she retells in a science fiction context here. Ordinarily what happens is that the hero is battling with the monster to try and save human beings from the monstrous figure, but the monster is not simply evil. It's a presence that needs to be abided by, worked around. It's less that you destroy the monster than you work around it. So in this allegory, we have Wetigo who's capturing these settler characters, generally white characters, in an abandoned theater space, trapping them there. And what the hero does is she tricks the monster into taking on a greater enemy. And that is the military occupiers who exist outside in this allegorical world. We don't have a clear sense of all the parameters of this world, and it's possible that Goulet is going to develop this short film into a feature, in which case we'll see a much more elaborated version, a worlding of this universe. We have a sense here in terms of the way in which Indigenous stories have talked about the legacies of colonialism, of Indigenous land being taken over by colonial presences. That's certainly the feeling we have at the beginning of the film as we see our heroine with bow and arrow, escaping, fighting, hiding from an occupation force. And the idea of tricking the monster into taking on the greater enemy, the military occupiers, is a way of taking that ancient malevolent force and directing it towards a real enemy. In this way, we might think of it as an allegory of Indigenous survival. The monster is not simply evil, an evil other, but a force that needs to be directed to an appropriate goal. And the hero is not interested in simply destroying an enemy, but rather, or in simple violence or revenge, but in making a better world. So like Annihilation, the moral universe of Awakening is more complex, and I very much hope that the feature film gets made. All right, so we've looked at 4 different films, all of which are telling stories in an allegorical way. The surface world, the surface diegetic world, is not one we're meant to exist in or take entirely seriously. Rather, it's the deeper themes that are underlying that, especially in terms of genre, in terms of the other stories that science fiction is always telling, that I think are most interesting to us. And all of them relate to the idea of relationship between humanity and nature, a kind of ecological allegory. And all of them have a global scale. They're dealing with a sense of an entire world being occupied, taken over, threatened. In that way, it's a kind of global consciousness, one that we're very much in as we try and get through the COVID-19 crisis. Hope you're all well, and good luck in the exam.